Years ago, as part of a job, I helped to plan an outing for a group of high school students. It was a bus trip to the big city for the day, so time to see the sights and eat something unhealthy for lunch and generally goof off. You know how school field trips are. The day of the trip came, and my phone rang in the middle of the morning. It was one of the two chaperones who was working with the group. "It's a disaster," he said. "The kids are running everywhere. They're not listening to me. I think one of them is eating ice cream for breakfast. You've got to do something." I thanked him for his call, and while I was sitting there trying to think of what that something might be, my phone rang again, and this time it was the other chaperone. "Hi, Andy," she said. "Just calling to tell you things are going great. The kids are having a wonderful time. I think it's just what they needed. Thanks for putting this together." She clearly didn't know about the other call I had just received. And it's amazing, isn't it, that people can see the very same situation in very different ways. The reading we have from John's Gospel today is about lots and lots of different things. For one thing, it's a miracle story, an account of one of Jesus' astounding acts that brought lots of attention and woke people up to the fact that this was no ordinary teacher in their midst. It's the only miracle story that actually appears in every one of the Gospels, so it's clearly one that the earliest Christian communities knew about and cared about a lot. It's a picture of this one who was filled, in the words of the letter to the Ephesians, with all the fullness of God. So it's about an incredible miracle that reveals something of who Jesus is. It's also about communion. Lots of people have pointed out over the ages that John's Gospel doesn't have a Last Supper. It doesn't have the familiar scene the other Gospels do, with Jesus blessing bread and wine and sharing them with his friends at the end of his life. So for John, this scene, with Jesus giving thanks and passing bread around, is especially significant. The story of everybody being fed and satisfied is one powerful image of what happens every time we gather at the communion table. It's a story about those big, lofty, important theological ideas. But when I came to it this week, I was struck by the fact that it's also about something very simple, about how people can see the same situation in very different ways. The story begins with Jesus and the disciples headed off to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They're headed to a remote place, presumably to get away from the busy work of tending to the crowds for a time. We can understand that, I think. Rest is an essential part of life, and at this point in the story, Jesus and the disciples have not been finding much of it. That was Jesus' invitation to the disciples in the reading we heard a week ago. Come away and rest a while. But if that was the invitation last week, the invitation this week is something different. It's a reminder that we're called not only to rest, but also to see the needs around us and to see them as part of our story as well. Jesus and the disciples are off in that restful place when they see the crowds coming. And when John says crowds, he means crowds. 5,000, we're told, tromping out to that grassy spot where Jesus and the disciples have set up for their retreat. The crowds are either a little bit dense and don't get the fact that Jesus and the disciples probably picked this remote spot for a reason, or if they do get the hint, they don't care. They're coming, and there's nothing to be done about it. Crowds are gathering, the sun is dipping toward the horizon, stomachs are starting to rumble, the scene is set. And in John's telling, there are two ways to see it. The disciples have one way of seeing. 6 months' wages wouldn't buy enough for everybody to even get a bite. Philip responds with some exasperation when Jesus asks him where they're going to buy enough food. Andrew chimes in with what sounds like a joke. "There's a kid over here with a snack, but fat load of good that's going to do." "This is ridiculous, Jesus," they both seem to say. "We don't have enough. This whole picnic idea is a nice idea and all, but it just won't work. We came out here for ourselves, to get away from it all, to get in, and we didn't come here to build an outdoor cafe. In the other Gospels, they urge Jesus to do the decent and practical thing and send everybody home. So that's one way of seeing the scene. But there is another, if you listen for it carefully. We don't get the boy's name, and we don't learn how his food came to the disciples' attention. Maybe Andrew spotted him getting ready to take a bite and said, well, hey, look, that kid has something over there. Maybe he didn't have a whole lot of choice in the matter. Maybe. But I like to think that something else happened. I like to think the boy could tell what was going on, could see the adults getting all worked up about the details. And while they were sitting there paralyzed where all there was to do and how small the resources looked, he took out his snack and said, here's what I have. Would this help? There were two ways of seeing that busy, hungry scene. And there's no question about which one made a difference. You could say that the disciples looked at the scene in terms of scarcity. And you could say that the boy looked at it in terms of abundance. Scarcity says there's not enough to go around and there never will be. It focuses on what's not there rather than what is. And the more I think about it, the more I think that attitude is woven through and through our lives today. It's the sort of thinking that drives consumerism. You don't have the latest summer look, says the commercial. You don't have the right car or the right body or the right brand of coffee machine, and therefore you don't have what you need. It's the sort of thinking that leads nations and communities to hunker down and keep others out. If we let you in, says this sort of thinking, there won't be enough for us. It's the sort of thinking that can paralyze churches and forever keep them from trying anything new. Well, we don't have enough volunteers for that, says this sort of thinking, or enough money or enough professional help. We couldn't possibly teach or feed or reach out in that way. Scarcity says there's never enough. And abundance says that together we have what we need to do what we're called to do. Well, I'm not really much of a musician, says Scarcity. I've never had private voice lessons or performed at Paleo. I love to sing, says Abundance, and I'm glad to offer what I can, alongside others in the choir. My small contribution won't make much difference in the church budget, says Scarcity. Here's what I can do, says Abundance, and I'm glad to do it, alongside everybody else. The needs of the world are just too great, says Scarcity. The little I could do could not possibly make a difference. Here is something I can do, says Abundance, and who knows what difference that might make. I know this can sound a little bit like I'm just telling you to think more positively. And while that certainly doesn't hurt, I think we are talking about something else here. We're not saying that if you just have a better attitude, everything will work out the way you want it to. We're talking instead about a matter of faith, about a way of approaching life that says God gives abundantly and can do much with little. We're talking about believing that God gives us what we need to do what it is that we are called to do. This past week, I found myself at the offices of the Hospice General with a few members of our community. After our Lenten season at church here this year, with a refugee tent set up in our church garden and the continuing news coverage of the refugee crisis, several people in our community have been asking what we might be able to do. This office we were at helps to coordinate efforts on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers here in Geneva, so it was a place to start. You know as well as I do, the needs are enormous. And we're not a huge church. We don't have millions of francs to work with or hordes of full-time staff with big, wide-open calendars. But we do have something. We have a welcoming community that is diverse and loving and hopeful. We are a place full of ears that are ready to listen. And even though we don't all know just what a refugee might be going through, most of us do know something about what it's like to be far from home. few loaves, a couple fish. Here's what we have. Might this help? And they were looking at the very same scene. The same field, the same hungry people milling around, the same evening light. But the disciples and the boy saw it differently. While the disciples saw what wasn't there, the boy saw what was. While the disciples saw a paralyzing problem, the boy, and Jesus right alongside him, saw gifts to be offered. That's the invitation to our community, for our lives, for our own gifts, to approach them all with that sense of abundance. Not because we'll be saved by putting on a pair of rose-colored glasses, but because we worship a God who gives abundantly, who can do much with little, who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we ask or imagine. The boy offered his gift, and in Jesus' hands, it was enough. Enough to set a feast in motion and bring strangers together and satisfy hunger with some left over. There's no telling what good God will do when we bring our gifts as well and offer them with open hands. Amen.